let's talk about how to convert strings to ints. So the problem we're looking at is changing the string, double quote 1, 2, 3, double quote, which has 3 characters in it, into the int 123. Now the difference between these two is very important to remember. Int is a primitive data type, string is an object type. These are very different types, and you can do different things with each. Now this is a problem that has a lot of solutions. We're going to examine 5 different options here. Now, the reason that I think it's good to examine different options is that sometimes one option is much better than another. It's a very common mistake for beginning programmers. If they can think of one way to do something, they kind of do it that way and forget that sometimes there may be a much better way out there. Now, in a sense, I understand, because when you're first programming, it is hard to think of all the different possibilities. But it is a fun exercise, and it does have more than just intellectual merit. Now, the way that I found the options here was by looking for methods in the API that have string parameters and int or integer return values. So that's where I got started. Pay attention to the use of objects versus class methods, because that will make it much easier for you to understand what's going on. Remember that class methods have static in their signature. So here's the first way, and this way is almost a cheat because it uses something we already know. We can actually use a string to construct a scanner object. So we could do string letters equals new string, 1, 2, 3. Then use that string to create a scanner. So we'll have scanner, input is new scanner, and then of letters. So instead of putting system.in in there, we're putting the string letters in. Then we have int number equals input.nextInt. So that takes our scanner object input and pulls the next integer out of it. Well, the next integer is 123, and that's what gets stored in number. Here's the second way. Let's use a class method in the integer class. Now, like I said before, the class methods are labeled static. And when they're called integer, that's the name of the class, and then period, a method name. The arguments, if there are any, go in the parentheses. Now, there are 2 options that immediately spring to mind. One is int parseInt with a parameter string source, and that converts decimal only. That's actually fine for our purposes because we're only using decimals at this point. Now, there's another method called integer decode string source. So here, instead of returning an int, we are returning an integer object. Now, that's a type of object we haven't used yet. So we might be a little bit cautious about that. One thing that's nice about decode is it can handle decimal, hexadecimal, which is base 16, and octal, which is base 8. Now when I say nice, I mean nice for a professional programmer. I don't really mean nice for us. In fact, the only thing we care about is that it can handle decimal. So which option are we going to choose? Well, if we take an integer object, we're going to have to figure out what to do with it. That's not impossible to do, and in fact, we're going to do it in a few minutes. But that first one that just returns an int value, that's really nice because we know what to do with an int. So right there is the code. Int number equals integer.parseInt, and then the argument is the string 1, 2, 3. You also could have put a string reference there if you wanted to. So there's our second technique. Now, before we go on to any further techniques, let's talk a little bit about the integer class. An integer object holds a single primitive data type int. Now, that might seem kind of weird, and the integer class is kind of a weird class. It's something called a wrapper class, and what it does is it wraps around a primitive data type. Now, this might seem incredibly inefficient, and it is, but it turns out it does some really cool things later on. In order to see those cool things, you're going to need to take a course like CS 2334, Programming Structures and Abstractions. So for right now, we can just think of it as being a way of taking a primitive data type and moving it into an object type. So if we construct an integer object, like integer number equals new int, and then in parentheses 7, so the argument is 7, this is what we get. A reference to an integer object called number, and an integer object that contains a 7. Well, this brings on the third and fourth way to perform our string to int task. we can use decode in the integer class. So we create our string num is new string, double quotes, 1, 2, 3. And then we create our integer object. So we'll have integer number. Number is a reference to an integer, remember, is integer.decode of num. Now remember, integer.decode returned an integer object, not an int type. Well, we've got a little problem now. We're actually not finished because we need to get our int value outside of this integer object. Now that's a method in the class. If you look at the API, you will find it. So what you do is this. Int value is number.intValue. So notice number is an integer object, so we're using the object reference, period, and then the method name, int value. You can read about that more in the API. Now, as far as the fourth way is exactly like the third except for one thing. There is another method in the integer class that's called value of, and you can use that instead of decode. Other than that, it works exactly the same way. Now, you might think it's kind of weird that we have so many different methods that do kind of the same thing, but they have different purposes and they're used for different things. As you program more, this will make more and more sense. For right now, it's great to know one way to do things. And here's the fifth and final way. We can actually construct an integer object from the string. Now, the way we know that's possible is by looking at the constructors in the Java API page for integer. Let's actually go and do that. Here's the Java API. I'm going to search for an integer object. Notice there are a number of classes that have the word integer in it. We want the one that's just integer by itself. And right here is a summary of the constructors. So right here we have a second constructor that constructs a newly allocated integer object that represents the int value indicated by the string parameter. You will see the other methods that we've been using here. There's the decode method. Our int value method that we used a few minutes ago is here. Notice that that is not a static method. That's an instance method. So instead of having the class name in front of it, it will have an integer object name when it gets called. Here's the parseInt method that we used earlier. So there are lots of different possibilities there. It's a good thing to spend some time with the API and read around it, even though it can be a little frustrating at first. We construct the integer object from the string. So string letters equals new string, and then double quote 1, 2, 3. And here we're constructing the integer object from the string object. Integer number equals new integer of letters. We also could have put double quote 1, 2, 3 double quote there instead of the reference to letters. That would have been fine too. And then we'll do int value is number.intValue. So there is our fifth way to solve this problem. Now, the Java API has figured prominently in this discussion. All of these methods are documented in the API. The thing is, reading the API can be very challenging at first. It's written for professional software engineers, and it's not really written for beginners, and that's unfortunate. So the critical skill that you need to develop to work with the API is you just skip over things that don't make sense. There are corners of the API that don't make perfect sense to me. I just skip them until I need to know them. When I really need to know them, that's when I work hard to learn them. But a lot of the details that you'll be exposed to at first are going to be things you don't really need to know. So don't let that stop you from reading and trying to get what you can out of it. Now, the more you read the API, the better you'll understand it. And in time, it'll be your best friend. Just probably not the first day. So keep programming.